it through the window in the wall and escaped from his hands.
Good morning. It's good to be here and to worship with you this morning. Good to see all your faces. There are a few of you that I don't know that I've had the opportunity to shake your hand, and so I hope you'll stand around for a few minutes afterward and allow me to do so. It's good to see Miss Margie here this morning and to know that she's well enough to be able to be here. As we continue this series that we've been studying, we've looked so far at three different individuals that exemplified what it means to be profitable to God. We're trying to answer the question, how do I become profitable to God? How do I take the things that God has invested in me and put them to use for Him? We've looked at the life of Abraham and how Abraham was faithful and produced profit through his faith. We looked at the life of Esther and how Esther was courageous and how she used her courage to be profitable to God. We looked at the life of Jesus and how much Jesus cared about the needs of people both physically and spiritually, and how his care enabled him to be profitable. This morning we're going to add to that list. But before we do so, I want to remind you of a popular children's story that was read to me when I was growing up. The book is called If You Give a Moose a Muffin. And the story simply goes that if you give a moose a muffin, he'll ask you for some jam. And if you give him some jam, he'll ask you for another muffin. And eventually you're going to run out of muffins. And so he's going to ask you to make some more. And if you're going to make more, you're going to have to go to the store and pick up another box of mix. And if you go to the store, the moose is going to ask to come with you. But it's cold outside, so the moose is going to ask for a sweater. And if you give him a sweater, he's going to notice that one of the buttons are loose. And so he's going to ask for a needle and thread. And the story goes on and on and on and on. Each time you give the moose what he asks for something else. Because he's never truly content. This morning, we're going to look at the life of the Apostle Paul. And if you do not remember anything else, remember this. If we are going to be profitable to God, we're going to have to learn how to be content. Because contentment enables us to weather the storms of life. Look with me at Philippians chapter 4. Philippians chapter 4, let's look at verses 10 through 13. Paul writes to the Philippian church, "But I rejoice in the Lord greatly, that now at last you have received your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned before, but lacked opportunity. Not that I am speaking from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstance I am. I know how to get along with humble means and how to live in prosperity. In every circumstance I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. I can do all things through Him who strengthens me." If we're going to be profitable to God, we're going to have to learn how to be content. And Paul says he has learned in whatever circumstances he's in, how he is to be content. You know, what makes that statement impressive is that if we look at the context of the book, Paul is sitting in prison when he writes this. So Paul's circumstances at present is incarceration. And as he sits in a prison, chained to a wall, he writes to the Philippian church and he tells them, "I have learned how to be content." The whole reason that the Philippian church is concerned for him in the first place is because in Roman prisons, it's not like our prison system. You know, we have that phrase, 2 hots and a cot. In Roman prison, you're lucky if you get the cot. It's the responsibility of the people you know to support you while you're in prison. And so they're concerned about Paul. because they're worried about who is attending to his needs while he's in incarceration. And he's writing back to them and saying, don't worry, I'm content. I know how to live in prosperity and I know how to live in humility. Paul is content. He knows how to have a lot and how to have a little. You see, Paul was a Pharisee, meaning that he is an expert in Jewish law. He was a student of Gamaliel, a very famous teacher of law. So Paul knew what it meant to live a life of prosperity. In Jewish culture, the lawyers, the Pharisees, they're the hotshots. They're the ones that have the money and the prestige. Paul at one point had great status. But then, as our brother read for us a moment ago, Paul has also been shipwrecked. He's been beaten. He's been stoned. He's been imprisoned. Paul knows what it means to live the high life, to be that Pharisee, to have the prestige and the honor, but he knows what it's like to be the castaway and the criminal. Not that Paul was guilty of the things that he was punished for, but nonetheless, Paul knows what it means to live a life of prosperity and a life of humility. Put yourself in Paul's shoes. Imagine you're a wealthy lawyer. You have all the money you can imagine. You can have anything and everything you want. You have the nice houses, you have the nice cars, you go on the nice vacations, you have all the latest and greatest. And then you convert to Christ, and suddenly all your wealth is stripped away. And you go from being the man who teaches the law at the most prestigious law school to being the man who's beaten and broken and sitting in a prison cell. How would that affect your faith? For some, it would shatter it. There are some that their faith would be absolutely destroyed. They'd give up their faith and their commitment to Christ. But for others like Paul, it becomes a faith-building experience and forges an ironclad faith that is unshakable. The question this morning is, what is the difference? What makes the difference between the man who's able to experience all that and come out stronger and the man who experiences all that and loses his faith? And the key is contentment. Because contentment enables us to weather life's storms. It doesn't matter how bad life gets. If I'm content in whatever situation I am, then I can focus on what really matters. And that is being profitable to God. Contentment enables us to weather life's storms because it keeps us willing to suffer and focused on the task at hand. In Paul's letter to Timothy, Paul has much to tell Timothy regarding his ministry. If you look at the context of the book, it's not a positive book. Paul is scolding Timothy for his failures in his own ministry. And there are two key things that I want to look at in the second letter to Timothy that Paul is going to scold Timothy for. An unwillingness to suffer and a distraction. Timothy is not willing to suffer for the gospel, and he has become distracted. Look with me at 2 Timothy chapter 2. 2 Timothy chapter 2, starting in verse 3, Paul writes to Timothy, "Suffer hardship with me as a good soldier of Christ. No soldier in active service entangles himself in the affairs of everyday life, so that he may please the one who enlisted him." Timothy is going to have to learn two key things if he's going to be profitable to God. Timothy is going to have to learn how to suffer. Paul tells Timothy, be willing to suffer. You know, sometimes it's easy to say, yeah, if I suffer, I suffer. I'm not going to let that discourage my faith. But do we ever sit and say, I'm willing to suffer? I'm okay. It's something that if my faith is going to call me to suffer, then I'm willing to do it. You know, what I tend to see is people who are suffering, in the midst of their suffering, they're trying to navigate their faith. But it becomes a reaction. Paul is telling Timothy to prepare himself, to be ready ahead of time, to be willing to suffer. You see, Timothy is not willing to suffer. He's not content to live a hard life, and it's affecting his ministry. Timothy is becoming ineffective because his ministry is being hindered at the threat of suffering. The indication is that Timothy has either softened the things he's teaching or stopped teaching altogether because he's afraid of suffering. And Paul tells Timothy, you are going to have to be willing to suffer. We're going to have to be content to live a life of suffering. If we're going to be profitable to God, if we're going to be effective, we're going to have to prepare ourselves and say, I am committed to being a Christian and to living a life in service to God, even if it means I'm going to have to suffer. And it has to be a forethought. We cannot wait for the suffering to come and then decide if we're going to suffer or not. We have to choose right here, right now. I'm going to be someone who is willing to suffer, and I'm going to be content. And then the second thing that Paul tells Timothy is that he's going to have to be a good soldier. And he tells Timothy how to be a good soldier. He says, no soldier in active service entangles him in the affairs of everyday life, so that he may please the one who enlisted him as a soldier. It comes back to contentment. So many times I see people who aren't content with who's in office. They're not content with how much money they're making. They're not content with this, that, or the other. But for whatever reason, they're always striving to change their life, to make alterations, to make their life more comfortable, more easy. If only we could promote this one political candidate and then life would be so much better. If only I could make just a little bit more and then life would be so much better. If only I could have a nicer house or a nicer car, then life would just be better. They get so entangled in the affairs of everyday life that they forget that they are soldiers. We are soldiers. And a good soldier doesn't get entangled in daily affairs because he understands that he's fighting a war. And if we're fighting a war, we're going to have to be singularly focused on who our enemy is and how we can overcome them. If we're distracted by all of our wants and wishes, then we're not going to be effective. When a soldier is kicking in doors, his mind needs to be singularly focused on the task at hand. If he's distracted thinking about, I wonder what car I'm going to get when I get back, he's not going to be successful. He has to be focused. And if we're going to be focused on our spiritual fight, we're going to have to be content. Content to live with whatever means we have in the moment. Again, Paul, a Pharisee, has experienced what it's like to live the high life. But Paul, the shipwrecked, knows what it's like to not have anything at all. And Paul says, I am content. And he tells Timothy, be the good soldier. Be content. Be willing to live where you're at and not get distracted by trying to advance your means. When I talk to Christians about why they're not more involved, work becomes the most common. You know, growing up in the mission field, I talked a lot. I've talked a lot to people about mission work. And when I talk to people about mission work, all too often I hear people say, I'd love to go on a mission trip, but I'm just really busy with work right now. Somebody comes to church that hasn't been to church in a while. You shake their hand and I'm like, okay, hey, how's it going? What's up? We haven't seen you in a while. Is there anything we can do for you? Oh, no, I'm good. I've just been busy with work. Now, as a minister, I try to get people involved with things. We try to invite people to things. And when somebody doesn't show up to an event, I often hear somebody come and say, sorry I didn't make it to that event. I was at work. And I get it. I get that we have to make a living. We have to provide for our families. I'm not bashing that at all. But I think we ought to consider, is there something I can do to lower how much I have to work so that I can focus more on being a Christian and on being profitable to God? Can I be content with a little bit less in life if it means that I get to spend more time worshiping God and serving Him? Timothy needs to stop getting entangled in worldly affairs. He needs to be content, because in contentment, we have the ability to suffer and to keep our affairs in order. But not only that, contentment enables us to both live and die for Christ. A moment ago, we read from Philippians chapter 3 and how Paul had learned to be content. But if we look earlier in the chapter, we see something interesting that I really believe is the key to why Paul is able to be content. Philippians chapter 1, verse 21. Paul writes, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." As we read the book of Philippians, we ought to ask ourselves, what is it that enables a man who is educated, a man who had prestige wealth, to sit in a Roman prison and to write to the church and say, I'm okay, I'm content? What is it that allows him to have this mindset? How many of us could sit in prison and say, I'm content where I'm at? What is it about Paul that enables him to do this? It's a willingness to live or to die for Christ. And these two things, they go hand in hand. A willingness to live and die for Christ enables us to be content. And if we're content, we will live or die for Christ. Paul says, for me to live is Christ. What he's saying is, as long as I am alive, I'm going to work for Christ. I'm going to seek to be profitable to God. As long as there is life left in my body, I'm going to use it to glorify my God and my Creator and to bring others to Him. But if I die, I'm going to die for Christ. And if I die for Christ, it's gain. I receive a reward. It's something that we've mentioned periodically, especially when we're looking at Esther, this idea that the worst the world can threaten me with is death. And if I die, I go to heaven. And so it's not really a threat at all, is it? But if we're going to have that mindset, we're going to have to be content. We're going to have to be content with where we're at in life. We're going to have to be content with the reality that Christ has called me to suffer because I live set apart. I live in a fallen and sinful world, and I don't want to be a fallen and sinful person anymore. And so I'm going to rise above. I'm going to be set apart. And that may mean that I'm going to suffer, but I'm okay with that. I'm content because I'm living for Christ, and if I die, it's gain. Contentment enables us to do that. Paul is going to walk the Christian walk and to preach the word regardless of what it cost him. And if it cost him everything, he's going to be content because he's going to be in heaven. You know, there's an interesting historical aspect here. Paul has called Timothy to be a good soldier. When we look at world history, what we see is that many cultures have this idea of soldiers who die in combat are rewarded. The Vikings had this idea of Valhalla, that if you died in combat, you got to go to warrior's heaven. In World War II, the Japanese were greatly feared because it was said that the Japanese believed so intensely in the need to maintain honor that they would rather die in combat than be captured. This idea of soldiers who die in the process of executing their orders being rewarded is something that permeates through cultures all over the world. But the interesting thing is, we serve the only God that can truly reward faithful soldiers. I can't help but wonder how many Vikings were shocked to find out that Valhalla wasn't real. How many Japanese died in the process of carrying out their duties just to find out that they weren't wrong, that they were wrong. But we serve a God who can reward and who will reward the faithful soldier. So Paul tells Timothy to be a good soldier and to be willing to suffer. And the reason is because for us to live is Christ, but to die is gain. If we die as spiritual soldiers in the act of carrying out the duties that God has given us, we go to heaven. And the reward we receive will be worth all that we've experienced. But it's going to require us to be content. We're going to have to be content with where we are right now because we know that there's a day when we're going to receive something that's going to make it worth everything. In the moment we see the shining face of God and we hear Him say, "Well done, you good and faithful servant. Enter into the rest that I have prepared for you." It will be worth it. But we're going to have to be content in this life. We're going to have to be content to weather whatever storms the world throws at us. We're going to have to be content to suffer if we're called to do so. We're going to have to be content and not get entangled in worldly affairs. We're going to have to be content to both live and die for Christ. If we're willing to do that, then just like the Apostle Paul, we too will have an opportunity to be profitable to God. This morning, I understand that this lesson has not been particularly evangelistic. My goal this morning is not to necessarily convict you of something new or sensational, but to remind you that God has called us to be content in this life so that we may enjoy wealth in the next life. If you're here this morning and you haven't obeyed the gospel, then you will never be able to truly find contentment because you don't have the option or the opportunity to live and die for Christ without committing to Him through baptism. And so if you'd like to do that this morning, we want to help you. But I also understand that there are those in this room that have done that. And it is possible that we've wavered in our contentment. If you want to recommit yourself to being content, then you can do so by coming to God and repenting. But if you're here this morning and you've lived the life of contentment and you're living it right now, then I want to encourage you. I want to encourage each and every one of you to stand firm in the storms of life, to be willing to suffer, to keep your affairs in order, and to live for Christ so that when the day comes that you die, you will receive gain. If there's anything that the church can do for you this morning, please come forward as we stand or sing.